Deputy Coppinger, Deputy Ruth Coppinger.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. This group of amendments by the Socialist Party deputies is for the inclusion of social and affordable housing in the lists of projects that would be paid for by the taxpayer out of the Pension Reserve Fund and used in the new Strategic Investment Fund. Now, I was saying yesterday, Minister, that it was amazing to anybody outside of this House that such a thing will be excluded from a list of strategic investment projects, because the most strategic need in this country at the moment is the provision of affordable housing and of social housing for the 100,000 families on the housing list. Now, just before I came down here, yet again, another family had contacted me who are sleeping in their car for the last couple of nights. This is not the first case that we've heard. I could cite a whole number of other cases that I have in my books. My cases must be very different to yours, Minister, if you saw fit to leave out this strategic need out of this legislation. I'm also amazed that the Taoiseach isn't sitting there beside you, because over the weekend she suddenly discovered and talked loudly on the media about social and affordable housing and a low-pay commission. She must be Rip Van Winkle, having been asleep for the last number of years, because it's so blatantly obvious that there's a crying need for this to be built. Now, why do we need this? We need it because there's 100,000 families, as I said, on the housing waiting list for local authorities, and there's also 100,000 families in mortgage arrears or distress. We've seen an increase in the number of evictions or repossession attempts, rather, in the last number of weeks. But yet the only plan that the state currently has for the building of social housing units is for 449 units to be built. I've searched high and low, and that is all of the social housing units that we can see the state plans to build. If you contrast that to the last 100 years in this state, between the 1890s and the 1990s, on average there was 3,300 social housing units built every single year for that century. Now we've a housing emergency. It's really obvious that there's a need for public housing, and what does the state do? It talks about providing 449 in the next couple of years. Now, there's been two major occasions in the history of this state when a serious attempt was made to provide social and affordable housing. First of all, in the 1930s, from 1932 to 48, 53,000 local authority homes were built when we had a smaller population of 3 million people. If you took the equivalent per capita for today's population, it will be 79,500 social housing units that were built in that time frame, or 4,500 units a year. So that's 10 times more than our own government is planning was built in the 1930s to 40s in a country that was impoverished and in the grip of a recession. In the 1970s was also the second time that the state intervened to take action. From 1971 to 80, there were 64,170 council homes built, again for a population much smaller, 3 to 3.5 million. And if you put it into today's population figures, it will be 85 to 96,000, or 8.5 to 9,600 houses a year that will be being built if we took the 1970s as our model. A third of all housing was social housing. Now, what we've seen seems to be an ideological aversion by governments, including this one, in the last number of years to social housing. It started with Fianna Fáil, it would have to be said. Now it's continuing with Fine Gael, and it would seem with Labour as well, since they hold that ministry. In the 1970s, as I said, 15% of all households lived in a council or a local authority house, and it went down then in the 1990s to 8%. During the boom, there was significant house building that took place, but unfortunately a lot of it was out of people's price range, it was overpriced, and only 10% was social housing. We now have a really serious crisis on our hands because governments even then failed to listen to advisory groups. NESC, a very well-known, the National Economic Social Council group, advised in 2004 when there was so much money in the country, that 73,000 new social housing units should be built in the next 6 to 7 years, or 9,000 a year. So we can see that that was completely ignored. So now here we are. The state and yourself is bringing in a very significant piece of legislation which involves 5 to 6 billion now being used for strategic projects. Now, I think the building of homes can be very commercially viable. Obviously, we need affordable homes for the working poor of this country who are now priced out of buying a house and who can't get mortgages, which is still a huge blockage in the banking system, with cheap rates which could be provided for working people. We also need social housing for people who have no prospect of being able to buy a house. Now, you have the power to include the building of social and affordable houses and apartments in these projects, and I think that it's absolutely essential you agree to do so. It's also essential that councils are discussed with and arrangements are entered into to allow councils to undertake house building, and housing agencies as well, but it shouldn't just be housing agencies. Local authorities have built houses, have the track record from over the past number of decades. And I would call on you, Minister, to include this in and to accept this amendment if you want to be taken anyway seriously by the electorate, who clearly identified housing as a key issue in the recent elections.